people engage in illicit activity regardless of whether it's legal, illegal, or legal. We think that it's imperative that community members ought to protect their own community and those who do decide to engage in that behavior. We think that this House would look like Western liberal democracies, and we think that it looks like governments will engage with their community leaders to come to a conclusion about which areas should be specific safe zones to engage in this nonviolent illicit behavior. We think this would look like legalizing traditionally known red light districts, among other things, but we think that this would look like the community members and the government reaching an agreement together to have a zone that would meet this objective. We think that violence that does occur in these communities and in these regions would be accounted for, i.e. this looks like if a sex worker is raped or is sexually assaulted, that is not okay, that is violent behavior, you could still have reparation or repercussions for that. We think that that would be handled in a way that the state would handle any other violent crime, among other things. We think that the burden for this debate should be why these safe zones provide more good for communities, and then we think the opposition ground would be why they do not provide more good or harm. We're going to discuss today, first on the pragmatics of what this model would allow, and then before touching on why we ought to protect marginalized bodies most. Before, do you have a question on the model?
Sure, so for these red line districts, are these going to be permitting all of these different types of criminal activity, or are they going to kind of be like segregated apart?
No, I think that it would all be illicit activity in one group. So this would be like drugs, sex work, everything that was listed in the motion, we think would happen in that community itself. We don't think that they would be segregated based on type of illicit activity. So first onto this pragmatic point. So we think that in the status quo, people already engage in a lot of this activity, right? People already use drugs, people already opt in to sex practices and to engage in sex work, right? So why is this harmful when it is consistently illicit and illegal? We think when it goes underground. It's oftentimes done in secrecy. It's oftentimes done in areas and regions that they don't want the government to find out. So why is that so harmful? It means that if I'm a sex worker and I'm experiencing rape or sexual assault, I don't want to go to the police and report it because I'm afraid that I will get repercussions because I've been engaging in this illicit activity. We think this also looks like some harmful drug practices, oftentimes using bad drugs or using dirty needles, because oftentimes these individuals are disincentivized in the status quo from going to hospitals or going to local authorities to complain that the drugs they were sold was actually harmful to them or caused their friend to overdose. So we think that oftentimes these individuals living in a perpetual state of fear are scared of arrest, and that puts them at disproportionate harms, right? So what does it look like on our side of the house with the alternative? We think that having legal spaces means that I can go to the police if I have these other claims. It looks like if I were engaging in drug activity in a safe zone and I had a girl needle provided to me or bad drugs provided to me that caused a different side effects than what I was expecting, I could go to the authorities and make a claim for that, no thank you. I could go to the authorities and say that yes, I was engaging in sex work in this district, but I was assaulted, please help me. We think that we're decreasing the barriers for oftentimes these individuals would not be able to overcome if they were living in a world where this behavior was not legalized. Because what do we think this ultimately allows for? It allows for the creation of self-policing and self-regulation in these safe zones, right? So if I'm consistently known for selling bad drugs that are oftentimes harmful, we think in the status quo there's no check back to this because people are afraid to come forward. If we have a legalized area, we think this looks like people can talk to each other in the open and say, hey, that guy sells some really weird stuff. Maybe don't buy from that. And we think that you can have a self-policing mentality in that type of area to one, phase out unsafe sex practices or among other things, or unsafe drugs. We think this looks exactly like the needle exchange that was, I'll get to at the bottom of this point, we think this looks like the needle exchange that was so effective to help prevent the spread of HIV by using dirty needles. For the needle exchange, was these clinics essentially opened up and allowed individuals who were addicted to heroin to come in and exchange their needles for clean ones. Yes, we recognize that people are still going to be engaging in this behavior, but we think on both sides of the house, they'll be engaging with this behavior anyway. We would prefer marginal change where at least individuals get access to more safe practices and better safety as a whole. Before I get on to my second point, protecting specifically the Black community and marginalized bodies, I'll take closing.
Quite literally, all of these benefits are achieved by A, legalizing all of these illicit activities, and B, increasing funding for rehabilitative services. What unique benefits do you get by creating semi-autonomous zones that are more susceptible to discrimination against individuals because these practices are separate from the rest of the society?
Sure, so we think we live in a world where we're never going to get legalization carte blanche approved. We think that we should probably listen into like a realistic alternative, where like in an incredibly like conservative society, where I think the best option would be to create a zone versus like having the whole, all drug use, among other things, uncriminalized, right? So we think like in the terms of realism, we would probably get a better shot of getting political advocacy by creating these safer zones versus like legalizing it as a whole. But I think they're going to have to do the legwork to tell us why like we would get that in the first place. On to our second point, which is protecting marginalized bodies. One, we think like the status quo is consistently targeting other individuals, specifically black bodies via racism, and they're disproportionately targeted more than other groups. I think the greatest example of this disparity is like the crack coke disparity, right? Where like white people are consistently less convicted for using like pretty much the same drug that black individuals use, right? And this disparity is reflected in the amount of like individuals that go to jail, mostly black individuals that go to jail for using drugs, among other things. So we recognize that we're not going to change the legal system. However, we think that the marginal benefits we procure on our side of the house are the most advantageous for these groups. Why? One, we think that we're going to have these individuals have a safe space to use these drugs, which prohibits their arrest for this use. We literally think one of the biggest impacts would be we'll stop putting these people in, or stop putting these like individuals in jail for using a drug, right? We think that they're allowed to still engage back in their community. Another point is like, can we just engage in how destructive it is for like the community as a whole to have most of their like young men being removed for a drug that white men are using at the same time? Like we find that the disparity is actually ripping apart communities and the fabric of how they engage in society, right? So we think that we would prefer marginal change where we legalize these spaces and then get access to for individuals who do engage in this behavior to get like better benefits for them, right? Because Ciera is also going to discuss agency, and why we think individuals ought to have like the ability to opt into these behaviors, and also the impact on feminine bodies. So at the end of the day, because of the pragmatic benefits and protecting these marginalized communities, we are so happy to propose.
In terms of framing, what we think is important is that we want to mitigate the presence of these illegal activities in terms of how they harm individuals. We think that reducing harm is common for both sides of this debate, but what is important is that whether the state ought to sanction these illegal activities that are happening, or ought we invest in these communities, and not just in one district, but like in the overall areas of which these criminal activities occur. At the end of the day, we think that we provide far better benefits in terms of mitigating these illegal activities by investing in these communities with services and understanding that government has been culpable with a lot of these harms that have been happening. So 3 points of deconstruction before I go into my main material. The first point of deconstruction talks about, just is like model critique, right? So they say that they're going to create these red line districts where they're going to have all types of criminal activity permitted. So what you're going to have in terms of like trying to help these individuals is that instead of trying to like easily decipher specific criminal activity that's going on, you're going to increase the concentration of different criminal behavior. So you have individuals who are engaging in sex trafficking who are also exposed to individuals who are engaging in drug dealing. We think that type of exposure is really harmful and it's going to increase criminal activity. The second point of deconstruction then talks about how right now people who are committing in these illicit activities don't want to go to the authorities because their activities are illegal. 3%, and they say that restricting it to a district is going to now help with policing. 3 responses. So first of all, we don't think that policemen are necessarily going to go into these districts because they're going to be quite violent, right? When you have all these criminal activities happening within the same area and it's literally only restricted to one place, we think that policemen are going to see that these are like quite dangerous activities. But even if the policemen go and try to provide services and help out, we think that the help that they provide ends at the boundaries of the red line district, right? And we think that the third response to this is that you're going to have more of this concentration of crime within one area, and you're going to decrease investment into the rest of the broader community. We think that's going to be a bad thing. But last point of deconstruction then just talks about how they're going to achieve these marginal benefits by providing for these safe spaces. But we think we're going to have much more deeper and much more stronger benefits when you actually focus on the long-term roots of the problem in terms of investing in services. Sure.
Okay, considering the city of Amsterdam has legalized things like the red light district and we see integration of the police force, when this motion talks about non-violence, we assume that the police can determine what a murder or violent robbery is as opposed to drug use or prostitution.
Okay, fantastic. Well, two responses to this, because I'm going to talk about this later. So there are places like Amsterdam where they haven't implemented this activity, but we think that just because you have this notion in Western local democracies doesn't mean it's going to become as effective as we've seen in Amsterdam. For example, we think that in places like the United States, where there are large institutional racism that occurs within those areas and large criminalization of people who are people of color, we think that's a far different social contextualization versus Amsterdam, which is very homogenous and doesn't have the same history of the United States. So it's not going to work perfectly in those cases. 3 points then. First, I'm going to provide a counter plan. Second, I'm going to talk about the government obligation. And third, I'm going to talk about why this increases more harms to these most vulnerable individuals. But first, talking about this counter plan. First, what we would propose to you is the government, instead investing in services such as a social security net, such as more community redevelopment, and in terms of providing for more security for these individuals. Why is this mutually exclusive from the government model? First of all, we think it is mutually exclusive because of the fact that when you have a red line district, it is government sanctioning those illegal activities, right? And when they sanction those illegal activities, they're permitting that those illegal activities to occur, and they're kind of not claiming any responsibility for those harms. We think that we want more government involvement and investment in terms of the problems that are happening right now. We think that once you start actually investing into services, it's government saying that we need to actually involve ourselves within these criminal activities, and we need to do that by saying that these activities are illegal, and the best way to mitigate against that is investing in services. So second then, I want to talk about this government obligation, right? Because we think that the government has an obligation to help the most vulnerable of these individuals. What are we talking about? We understand that there are still going to be people that are going to recreationally use drugs, and that there are some people that are going to continually committing illicit activity for pleasure. But we think the most important stakeholder are people who are coerced into these types of crimes, and we think we better help people who are coerced into committing harms to themselves on our side once you invest in the social safety net. Additionally, we think that what is most important, why this obligation is so important, because government has a culpability in these crimes that are happening right now. Why has this been happening where people are resorting to dealing drugs or selling their bodies? We think that first of all, there's a way where government has mitigated the ability for people to have upwards mobility, right? In the United States, when you have housing policies that have literally created neighborhoods that are less well off, and where individuals cannot buy housing, cannot buy property, then you close people off from having an ability to earn money in a normal way. And additionally, we think the justice system, especially in places like in the United States, like stop and frisk policies, have continued this perception where people who commit illicit activities are criminal. What we think is most important and different on the opposition side is we want to shift the perception of how we view people who commit these illicit activities. They are not criminals on our side. We want to start viewing them as victims because we think that the government has been the main actor in terms of pushing people towards these activities. We think that when the government has allowed medical companies to start selling Oxycontin to people for their painkillers, we think that they've been culpable in starting an opioid epidemic that has been proliferating the entirety of the world. We think that in terms of the fact that the government has said that we are going to prosecute individuals for committing these drug crimes, that is when government has failed. Instead of saying they are criminals, we think that they are the victims. And we think that the better way to help these victims is through engaging in this social safety net rather than just putting all these individuals in one district, leaving them there and saying that the problem is done. So third thing, why this is going to increase more harms. We think that, first of all, that we're going to increase the concentration of these illicit activities because different activities are going to be exposed to each other, right? So when you have a person who is engaging in prostitution, you're going to be exposed to people who are committing indirect crimes. We think that, for example, people who are in jail, when you're exposed to people committing to those different crimes, there's going to be an increase in those crimes. But most importantly, we think you never change the incentives for these criminal activities to decrease. You're going to have people manipulating these victims of our system, and you're going to continue harm. At least on our side, we change that by committing to the roots of the problem. On their side, we just try to fix the symptoms. Proud to advise.
Drugs are good, coming essentially from USAFA, in which you can't have any drugs. But what I think we're really going to get from today's round in a couple of ways is I really want to talk about, because I think there's going to be a bench split that's going to occur, because MATHAP has already indicated their willingness to say, why don't we just make everything legalized? And I think we have this social, I don't know, we're going to invest more in our social communities coming from the front half. I'm going to explain why both of these are just horrible policies, and also why, especially the first one, is not at all mutually exclusive. And then I'm going to talk about agency and why we think agency is what we should, what is the proper extension coming from mine and Sam's speech. Because what we think we're coming up from the last speaker is a couple of things. So the first is that they want you to believe, essentially, that when you put them together, we're going to increase criminal activity. Okay, the problem here is I don't really know how you can create a red light district that's just going to say oh, all the opioid people here, all of the sex workers here. I think that is pragmatically impossible, right? So I don't think that this is something that governments could actually do in the sense that I'm just going to create little tiny squares in which people can stand in depending on your drug of choice, right? Because I think that is problematic for a couple of reasons. The second is also I don't think there's any analysis to tell us why that specifically increases criminal activity, and all the rhetoric they want you to believe in essentially how these people are victims, they're being forced into the system, I think kind of runs counter to this narrative that if we just put you near it, you're going to essentially consume. Because I think the problem becomes that, and I think this is the biggest response we're going to get to closing, is essentially that if we do legalize everything, right, that we think this equals a spread to society. This equals the impacts that I think their top half are trying to go for. Essentially, if we have everyone in society is now able to have access to it, it's harder to control. And I think it's harder to control in three ways. I think the first is essentially it means that access to the young is a lot. If I have a square area that I'm essentially saying you can come practice in, we think it's a lot harder, we think for certain minors maybe to go into that area. We also think it's probably harder essentially to have this illicit activity spread in the way that you have opioid epidemics in which they're available in your home, in your car, when you are with your children. That we think there's a unique difference between when we create the space that exists external to home and external to public and is rather very specific designated location. That we think we avoid a lot of these forms of criminal behavior and also criminal activity because essentially it is this separate space. I think the next argument that we really get essentially is they say it's going to be violent and the police aren't going to come because it's going to be violent. So one, that could be a good thing. I think it depends on the country. So yes, maybe the police not coming could be a good thing. I think this is exactly why Sam tells you we don't get essentially this criminalization of specifically marginal bodies. The second argument that I really think wins us here is essentially yes, even if it's violent, we do think we have status quo tells you that communities are much better at checking themselves when they're actually allowed to operate in the open, right? So the difference here is rather than having sex workers essentially have to take their clients back to very dingy and awful hotel rooms that are very separate from other sex workers and other areas, we now essentially have a community that people can actually rely on. We think this allows for self-enforcing mechanisms in which I can group together with my friends in this community and we can say that certain types of norms and behaviors are not acceptable, they're not okay, and we actually see a lot of red line districts, the best amount of policing that you do see is also by locals, the local community themselves acting as the policing force. So we think we check back on that harm. And then I think the last thing they want to talk about is this counter plan, right? So I just did an NPDA tournament on Friday, and let me say my head still hurts from it, but essentially I want to talk about how this is not a mutually exclusive policy in any way, right? Because at the end of the day, what I can do is I can essentially go in and I can create these districts, but at the same time also maybe have surround the district. I can pour in money that I'm going to essentially have needle exchange programs that are surrounding the district. I can also pour in essentially funds so essentially that I have clinics or other things that are going to help people get off opioids external, outside of the clinics. The biggest problem here, though, is what I think we solve for in the best world is we take people from essentially always having it being an illegal action that they're engaging with, and instead have it be in certain cases when they practice in a specific area, it is legal, that they're able to seek help, they're able to talk to other people that are going through similar circumstances that they are, they're able to essentially reach out, and we think that is beneficial. Because we say that the reason why people are not reaching out in the status quo isn't because they don't want help, it's because that they can't, or they feel like they can't, or because of when I use these illicit drugs, I'm using them in my home, which essentially increases my chances of having an overdose rather than using them, I think, in a public space. That we think we overall make it a safer world on our side of the house. I'd like to take this backpack on anything.
Yeah, so do you think there will be discrimination from an employer, for instance, against an individual when that employer learns that the individual lives in the drug and prostitution zone?
I mean, yeah, but that happens now, right? I don't think how this is anything unique. This let's talk about your world, right? And I don't really, maybe I'm wasting time because you're not actually going to go for this in your next speech. But what we do think though is this idea that you can legalize everything is ridiculous. And it's not actually good. It's not a good practice for a couple reasons. Because one, we think it increases exposure to the general public. Because rather than it, and this is where I'm going to talk about my agency argument here, is that we think when we create safe zones, right, and I think, or red light districts, or areas in which you can go, it is something you are opting into. You are physically walking into that area to use some drug, to use some type of do something that's illegal, that people would, or illicit, right? That people would not want general society to do, is what we think the term illicit would have connotations with. The problem is when I make something legal in general, I think it increases the usage of it, right? That essentially it changes it from being illicit in the first place to something that's being common practice. I do think that making pot essentially legal, and maybe other people would probably know better than me, has actually increased the usage by certain other individuals, essentially where they now are able to actually access this, and they're more likely to access it. There's a huge difference in access to this material that I think is uniquely important. Because what we think on our side of the house is we maximize the agency of the individuals to choose. If I choose to engage in this harmful behavior, that we honestly think that when I use opioids, that's probably not healthy for me. That's something that I'm opting into, I'm fundamentally opting into it, but it's not having the negative effects essentially of making it legal, when which everyone has to be exposed to it, has to see the harms of it, has to see it on a day-to-day basis. If I create a separate space for it, that separate space has the benefits essentially of protecting communities that are harmed by their usage, but it also has the benefits, I do think, of keeping it separate from general public, in which that we don't have essentially this overflow into general society. Because what people are choosing to do is choosing to use or choosing to engage. Because what we want to talk about on agency-wise is that we think when it comes to prostitution or engaging in sex workers, that we think these are things that people are actively choosing. They're choosing to be a sex worker, and if it is human trafficking, then we think that's illegal, right? In all worlds, let's just be clear here. But we think that they're choosing to be a sex worker, they're choosing to engage in this field. That we think on the opposite side of the house, right, we're taking away their ability to have agency, their ability to act, their ability to make decisions for themselves, and then on the back half world, we think we're making things a lot worse when it comes to opioid epidemics and horrible things. So what have we brought you today? The first is that first is that we think we've set up a model that allows us to engage in whether or not we need to maximize protect these specific communities by allowing for us into these separate areas in which illicit activities can be practiced, and how this benefits the general communities. Thank you.
When my partner talks to you about the importance and necessity of viewing this debate within the framework of mitigating the harms of people who engage in these kinds of activities, we think it's important to understand that we think the main harm is that we need to change the perception that exists for people who already engage in these kinds of illicit activities. We think that we are not talking today in this debate about people who opt in to doing illicit activities. And we believe that it's because we're always going to have hedonists, we're always going to have people that are going to be pleasure-oriented, and it's silly to try and stop them. We think it's more important to also realize that people who opt in to things like sex work or doing illicit drugs are the kinds of people who are already privileged enough to be able to have that be a choice in their lifestyle, not something they're worse to do. We believe in this debate we are talking specifically about the people who do not opt in to doing these kinds of illicit activities, but instead are coerced by oppressive systems of government. We believe that we need to change the perception that they are criminals of the state and not victims of the state and its oppression. Because of this, we think that government fails to solve in solving that perception, and we think that therefore they are not efficacious. 2 points in this debate, or 2 points in this speech, all by deconstruction will be interwoven. First, we're going to talk about whether or not this policy will be efficacious, even in the best version. But secondly, we're going to talk about why government have a unique obligation to admit culpability in order to change the way that we view these kinds of people. First, will this policy be efficacious? And opening government kind of has a broad idea of what they actually think solvency is going to look like. They think it's going to look like protecting those who are engaged in things like sex work or illicit drug use, and changing the stigmas of people who do these things. We think that there's 2 problems. First, we don't think that protection is guaranteed for these people, but secondly, we think that even if you do protect them, you're not changing the stigmas that surround them in the first place. First, onto why we don't think these people are necessarily going to be protected. We think that there's 2 ideas here. First, we think that these groups of people have so much inherent distrust of police, especially because police are usually the arm of the state that is most active in oppressing them, that people are never going to want to have the police walk into their brothel. People are never going to want to shoot up next to a cop because they already view them as being a literal embodiment of the state and as someone that is going to try and impress them in the long term. We think there's too much tension there for policing to actually be efficacious. But even more so, we do think that there is going to be a heightened sense of danger in these zones whenever you have all people doing all kinds of illicit activities in these zones. For example, in good jail systems, not necessarily the American one, they separate people based on what kind of crime they committed, because they don't want people who committed murder talking to people who are in jail for petty theft, because you tend to have a learning experience from these kinds of people. We think that you're going to get essentially a concentration of these kinds of activities, and you're going to essentially provide an education environment in how to engage in these different kinds of activities. But even if you don't buy that, we don't think that this ends up changing any kinds of stigmas. And we think that even the Deputy Prime Minister admits this in their speech. They say, look, we want these zones because we don't want this kind of activity everywhere. We don't want people in our society to be able to see these kinds of things happening. That is exactly the point. Whenever you don't understand why people are behaving in this kind of activity, whenever you're not forced to confront it in your daily life as you move around your community, we think that then all of a sudden it becomes something that is so much easier to deal with whenever it's out of sight, out of mind. Not in my backyard is essentially the solvency plan that we are getting from opening government. You don't have to confront why people are homeless when you don't see them. You don't have to question what different steps you took in our society and the steps our government took in our society to allow this to continue to happen. You don't change stigmas because it is now out of sight, out of mind, and we just don't care anymore. This policy is the easiest way for governments to wash their hands of their culpability in this situation, and we believe because of that, governments have a unique duty to confront it and to provide resources. But first, I will take top half.
The problem is, this is like you're stuck between a rock and a hard place. We tell you if you legalize everything, you have all the harms you talk about. But at least in our world, we can decrease some of the targeting that's happening to specific communities, which we think is at best like a net benefit.
We are also not talking about legalizing everything, and we think that it's because a lot of those harms do exist if you legalize them. We still believe in punishing these things, but we think it is more important to have actual resources, so that way people are not coerced by the state to engage in these kinds of activities. People are not forced to engage in these kinds of activities. And to my second point about the government obligation to admit culpability, and this is a lot of my partner's material. We think that part of the problem, whenever we hear these ideas, right, of like, oh, but the Netherlands has legalized drug use, Sweden has legalized prostitution to some degree, and look how successful it is, that we're not considering what it would look like in America. The nice thing about the Netherlands and Sweden and Portugal and any other country that has legalized this kind of process or has some kind of version of this policy is that my partner tells you they're all in a slightly different social context. Portugal, Sweden, and the Netherlands are all excessively ethnically homogenous, so we don't think you ever have that confrontation of like the crack coke disparity because you don't have those different racial biases to deal with. We think also those systems of government tend to be less oppressive than the one that we see in the United States in the first place. Just because there's time. But we think it's also important to talk about who uses who does these kinds of activities. Again, I already said that the people who opt into sex work, or the people who opt into drug use, are usually really privileged people. They're usually people who don't have to have this is a choice they are allowed to make. It's not a choice they are forced to make. We think that the difference is people who are not opting in are fundamentally coerced. And this is my partner's point about how these are victims of the state. The reason why people try and self-medicate with things like illegal opioids or illegal drugs is because there's a lack of a healthcare system that will provide for them. It is because the state fails to provide for them that they have to make this decision. We think that when there's a lack of social and economic mobility because perhaps of your criminal background or prior drug use, what ends up happening is that you now have to, instead of being able to get a job, you are forced into doing things like sex work. You don't change that on their side of the house. We believe that our counterplan of creating resources like, completely dedicating our government's efforts into creating a comprehensive healthcare reform, or simply just having an improved social security net, all of these things are going to end up helping these people in the long term because it gets at the roots of why they engage in these kinds of activities. You only change perception whenever government admits their fault, and you only have governments admitting their fault when they now have to dedicate resources to these people, not keep them out of sight, out of mind. Proud to oppose.
To the first person that found a piece of property that they said that this is mine and convinced everybody else that they were correct, fuck that guy. Because here's what happened. It led to this societal construction that we have this power of a leviathan over us, that the authority that should govern each of us is derived of the will of the people. But that comes from the idea of collective security, not individual rationality. And that's what's incredibly important. We see in our modern systems, even in Western liberal democracies today, that government has gone too far in taking on its burden. It is not about how we regulate individuals to say that the government knows best and how they make decisions. The government's responsibility should be to stay out of my life and make sure foreign invaders do not harm me. Don't regulate my guns, don't regulate my wife's uterus, and don't regulate what drugs I can take. Because I'm going to tell you and actually take a stand for this round that people should be able to do drugs and not just pansy around it like everybody else wants to. But first, let's go into some points of rebuttal. First, on the counterplan. This is not mutually exclusive. To quite frankly say that we should just focus on only reforming individuals, that we cannot have an outlet for rational actors to be able to do their own things, is ridiculous. Inside of this, we can assume that the police will continue to operate as it exists in places like Amsterdam. You can have mental health and drug information clinics inside of these zones, ladies and gentlemen. You can gain these benefits of informing individuals because we believe rational actors are individuals who can make a choice for what is good or bad for themselves and to continue to do it. And that comes with increased exposure and knowledge. That does not exist in a world that continues to criminalize individuals and paint them the way opposition wants to, as being decrepit members of society, when in reality, they're people too. Go ahead.
Look, you can fiat the creation of these zones where the activities can take place, but you cannot fiat good social safety nets being put into those communities to mitigate the harmful effects. Engaging the world where these communities are ghettoized and destroy the surrounding communities as a result of the devaluation and the stigmatization.
I will tell you that communities will solve it themselves when we stop treating them like babies. So the first thing is that extreme abuse can be curbed with knowledge of these substances. Oftentimes people aren't talking about things like heroin or even LSD because society thinks they're so bad, when in reality they might just increase your love of nature if you drop mushrooms out in the wilderness. They say that they are de-incentivizing they are in and of themselves de-incentivizing rational choice when they believe that the government can make that decision for you. If the problem is not individuals engaging in these illicit behaviors, it's the government's response to them engaging in these illicit behaviors. What we say is that people aren't going to be protected because they distrust the police. They distrust the police because of arbitrary restrictions like criminalizing marijuana as just
excuse to be able to imprison members of the African American community. When we take away those justifications for people to do that by giving an actual outlet for individuals, you decrease that mistrust. Interaction with community members, they say, will be a slippery slope to doing more intense drugs that'll eventually lead you down a bad path. This slippery slope only occurs when people don't have enough knowledge to stay off of the slope. Individuals, when they can build communal knowledge of how substances affect themselves and those who are close to them, are less likely as a community to decide that they should all engage in activity that will bring them down as opposed to activity that increases their individual experience, right? They make assumptions that illicit behaviors are committed by bad people. Right? This comes from a stigma. Members of society will interact with those who do drugs in these zones. It's not just the most depraved people in society. A stigma isn't created, and we're not sweeping it under the rug when down the street is the very place where you can smoke weed with all of your friends if you so choose to do so. Here's what we're going to tell you on closing government. That a small step to encourage and build rational society is incredibly important. Rational agents are able to choose both what is good and bad for them and continue to do so. We legalize cigarettes and allow people to smoke them even though it probably might give you cancer. It rests on the principle that individuals can see bad things that can occur to them from making a choice, but are still able to do so. Laws assume that humans are irrational, and they use guidance or force or the guise of popular opinion to restrict a single individual. You do not choose to be born in a democracy or being chosen to born into an authoritarian regime. You did not sign the contract to give the government power over them having control over you. What we want to say is that rational agents, you should, development is part of emancipation from your existing social structure. You developing whether or not you can take a drug or engage in illicit activity is the way in which you remove yourself from other influences. It decreases the ethos of society that is very much used to create the stigmas that opposition wants to talk to you about, when individuals can come to self-realization about why these things that people are doing or why these actions are being taken are not in fact bad, but instead affect the individual. There's a reason this motion calls for a difference between violent and non-violent illicit behavior. What we see in non-violent illicit behavior is an individual experience. The government does not have the authority to tell you that you as an individual making one action harms the collective. When if we remember from the beginning of this speech, that is the responsibility of government. If I want to lead myself down a path that other people might not agree that I should, ladies and gentlemen, that's called politics, and you allow us to vote on our beliefs like that. Why can't you let me put it into practice? The subconscious and humanity are confined by the ethos of law. Modern morality favors order over experience. Laws against illicit behavior limit human emotions that individuals feel. When you take a drug, or when you engage in sexual activity, even if it is to cope with some other problems you have in your life, we believe that that is incredibly important. The oxytocin that is released in your brain or pleasure chemicals come from either doing a good or bad thing, however lens of reality that you view it through. We believe that taboo is a limitation that assumes that unjust actions can exist. Even Foucault will tell you we need the ability to explore our sexual life, to deconstruct the idea that society or governments can oppress us into our individual actions and what we get to choose. This increases connections amongst community members when you're able to relate and speak with other members without the taboo of society. Because doing drugs or having sex is a very individualist experience. It changes your perceptions and how you connect with the world. It changes your personal philosophy. And being able to express that as an individual is incredibly humane. To be able to have that experience and share it legitimately is incredibly important. We're not trying to sweep a problem under the rug or mitigate it and believe that we can control what humans can do. Let someone smoke pot if they want to. I know I'm doing that after this round.
Once we cut through the libertarian bluster and the non-mutually exclusive model we got from the opening government, we were able to make a very simple observation. And that is that this round did a great job of focusing on maybe the first 2, 3, 4, or 5 years of effect as a result of this policy. What is neglecting is the fact that external to these zones that are being created by the optimistic opening and closing governments is a community and a public support system that will not like these zones. A community and a public support system that will see these zones as dangerous, as dirty, and unworthy of their dollars, their public property taxes, and their investment. Insofar as we can prove to you that the denigration and the ghettoization of these communities is almost very, very likely to exist on our side of the house, you should reject all of the principle and very tiny, tiny pragmatic consequences you get from the opening and closing government. I'm going to talk about the ghettoization of these communities, proving you all the things I just said are true, and then we're going to do some weighing at the end, tell you why we're beating all 3 teams in the round. So, on ghettoization, very, very important premise. What is the public perception of these zones very likely to look like? The first thing that people are likely to see these zones as is dangerous. That's for a couple of reasons. The first is that there is, as the opening team seem to agree so staunchly, there is a perception of that people who commit illicit acts of non-violent crimes as people who aren't active members of society, but more importantly, people who are dangerous. The important part of this is whether or not that is actually true. That is how people see them. As the closing government cleverly responds to Genevieve and Hayley's analysis, it's stigmatization, precisely. That's what we're talking about. But more importantly, I think there's actually very, very likely to be an increased amount of bad crime that is connected to the creation of these zones. These guys talk about Amsterdam a lot in the round, and this is very fascinating because they're all wrong about it, right? Amsterdam created places like the red light district, but communities within the surrounding area have heavily protested it despite the homogeneity of that particular area. 45 minutes south of Amsterdam is a community that has aggressively and almost successfully petitioned the Parliament of the Netherlands to get rid of that zone. Why is that? Because as soon as you have an illicit area of state-sanctioned activity, it's a lot easier to traffic human beings into those areas to participate without their consent into those particular crimes, which allows for the perpetuation of violent crimes that are external to those illicit activities that are non-violent. This is the perception. The same thing happens in Nevada. It's why everyone outside of Nevada hasn't legalized these zones for themselves. The second piece of perception argument here is that they're very likely to see them as dirty areas, right? Not just because of the stigmatization of needles and the stigmatization of sex workers who try to actualize themselves in society, but we think the poor individuals who are the most likely to be susceptible to things like the opioid crisis who are participating in these zones are likely to be seen as flocking to those areas and participating in them disproportionately to other members in society. Insofar as the public perception of these zones is likely to be extremely negative, what is the response? Let's talk about people, businesses, and then outside discrimination. First of all, on people. I think it's very likely that these people flock to the opposite side of town as soon as they realize that it's a zone very, very near to their communities, that they put a lot of time, energy, and investment into. They're not going to like the fact that these are being created. And insofar as they can directly connect the illicit behavior to the connection of trafficking, to the increase of crime, and to the denigration of the communities, again, I'm using quotes here because I'm a liberal and I don't believe that, but lots of people are extremely likely to. As soon as they flock to the opposite side of town or move farther and farther away from those areas, 3 things are likely to happen. The first is that property values are extremely likely to decline as a result of the decreased investment that you have in those communities. The second is that as a result of that, you get fewer dollars in property taxes going to schools, which means the education systems start to crumble, and you get the influx of things like private education from people like Betsy Voss. 3, you have generally less commitment to community activity, things like churches, things like social welfare, the very things that make a community a community. Second, what happens? Businesses leave. Insofar as those people leave to the other side of town, or the property gets more expensive, a lot cheaper in those areas, businesses are far less likely to be attracted. Why is that a bad thing? 1, because it means you get less economic investment in those areas, which allows people to increase their wages and their general quality of life. 2, you have fewer jobs available because as soon as businesses leave, you have nowhere to apply to. But 3, again, because those schools are gone, it means it's far less likely that businesses are going to expand in the area, which increases their outreach and decreases their prices. What does that mean for outside? So we've got people, we've got businesses. Now let's talk about people who are not necessarily going to be super close to these areas. John gives a PY that says, isn't it super duper likely that people, if you know that someone's from one of these areas, you're far less likely to hire them for a job? And we get this really lazy response to say, oh, well, that's already the status quo. Like, the difference is that those activities are not being encouraged by the state. As soon as you have people who connect the dramatic increase of crime and dirty, dangerous activity in those areas to the legalization of that government, to the people who participate in those activities, it's far more likely they're going to be discriminated against more. What does that mean? That means that you're far less likely to have support for social services within those areas. That means that you're far less likely to have churches who set up like places that feed people who are poor, because they don't want to be located near those epicenters of drug and crime. Why is that important? A couple of reasons. First, just in terms of, we're going to get to weighing in a second, but we think that this is going to result in a very negative government response. They say, oh, well, we're going to get social services within these areas. The communities will figure it out for themselves. I think you're far less likely to get public support for things like needle exchange programs and legalization of drugs writ large in the states that want them, because they associate the creation of the illegal zones with increases of crime. If they think that's going to harm their community, they're never going to petition their government to support them. And if the bill ever comes to a public ballot initiative, they're going to vote it down in drugs. So, just on the comparative here, what do we get from opening government? They say that they win the round because they're going to protect communities. We think there are 3 reasons that's not going to happen, where we're going to outweigh that. Before I go, I'll go ahead and take opening.
Okay, the problem is you are entirely non-unique. We already have entire communities that actually operate as de facto areas in which we think drug use is extremely higher, so they're punishing individuals of that community.
Right. Look, there's a difference between discriminating against people who live in high crime areas and discriminating against people because they're living in an area that was sanctioned by the state. We say that property values decreasing in the particular areas where you create these zones didn't previously exist, and insofar as that begins to happen, you get far less businesses and public attraction to those areas. It's really lazy to say, oh, that happens in the status quo. We're saying it's going to happen more, which is precisely why you're going to lose, OG, because we prove that you decrease the quality of individual life within those zones, and you spoil support for the resources they need the most. We beat opening government. Closing government says, libertarianism, do whatever you want. First, why don't you just do it for everyone and legalize it for the entire state? The principled extension of your analysis is that we should legalize all drugs because everyone has a right to do it. But second of all, we said that there's a weighing mechanism. It's not enough to be principled in this debate, insofar as we prove that you get a dramatically elevated levels of poverty and decreased level of support for communities that need those resources. We don't care that you have the right to do whatever you want. Other communities are going to make these people's lives horrible. That affects minorities and the people that you care supposedly the most about and use it as a chip in this debate. Worse. In terms of opening opposition, we think they do a great job providing short-term analysis in this debate as to how we stigmatize this use. We expand the scope of that harm to provide more analysis as to why we specifically deprive these areas of the support, money, people, housing equities, and things they need the most in this debate. Therefore, we think it's a closing out win. Thank you.
Sorry, I had a lot to get through. Ladies and gentlemen, if we had to characterize this debate, we think we would define collective security as the opening government. We would think that anything else but actually debating this motion to the opening opposition. And John, I would recommend to the closing opposition that basically stands up here and says that any individuals in this are going to be seen as ghetto, a racial term meant to decry and depreciate the value of an object, and then gives you more analysis as to how to, by this mere perception, we will devaluate these objects. We think fundamentally what this debate has to be about, and what it fundamentally comes down to, isn't the idea of whether this policy leads to these specific outcomes for these groups, but rather it is an undertaking of philosophy of how government ought to argue itself and how it ought to organize itself in response to how we perceive human beings. Our perception of human beings and how we think they ought to interact with society creates our political organization. That